Hello, everyone, and welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar, Series for Parents. I'm Laura Stack, your host and the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high THC marijuana on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. Johnny's Ambassadors was created in honor of my son, Johnny, who died by suicide in November 2019 after becoming delusional from using high THC concentrates. We have another excellent guest with us here today, whom I will introduce in just a moment. Couple quick logistics. This session is being recorded. Please share this video with your friends and family. We have a handout that Deji has kindly provided. It is either on this page if you're watching the recording, or if you're here with us live, it is in your control panel if you want to follow along with his slides. Deji will present for 45 minutes or so, and then he will take questions for 15 minutes. You notice that I am the only one on webcam. Sadly, we could not get Deji's webcam to cooperate with us today, but you will hear him and witness all of his incredible information that he will provide in his slides. I will introduce now Deji Ayonrinde, who is an associate professor of psychiatry and psychology at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, Canada. He is also the clinical director of community psychiatry programs at Providence Care and works in an assertive community treatment team. He trained at the Maudsley Hospital and Institute of Psychiatry in London, UK, with an MSc in research in psychiatry and an executive MBA from Imperial College London. He has a diploma in the history of medicine. Dr. Ayonrinde plays an active role in cannabis education and the impacts on mental health across the lifespan. He has worked with the media, schools, teachers, students, parents, university faculties, clinicians, and youth organizations on cannabis and mental health. Deji, thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. This presentation is to honor Johnny's memory, and I hope to give insight into issues to do with cannabis from a Canadian perspective. Some of it will be more general and broad, and hopefully mums, parents, educators, and others, dads as well, oh dear, and others would find areas that may be interesting. I'll welcome questions at the end. Thank you. So the title for today is Cannabis and Canadian Youth, Rolling the Joint or the Dice. And as heard earlier, my name is Deji, or Oyedeji Ayonrinde, and I work at Providence Care and Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So what's it about cannabis in Canada and rolling the joint or the dice? We've got a number of learning objectives. One is to gain insight into cannabis use by youth in Canada, pre and post legalization. As you're aware, cannabis has been made available, legal for recreational use since the year 2018. We'll be observing the role of cannabis in an early psychosis intervention program for youth and young adults. And we hope to appreciate the need for innovative cannabis literacy across different sectors. So why the interest or the concern? Well, cannabis was made legal in Canada for a number of reasons. Part of it was that there was such heavy consumption, but a lot of it wasn't of a quality or monitored in a way that was safe. So part of it was safety and in trying to limit the risk of harms. There was a huge gray or black market with products that had a whole range from those with pesticides, fertilizers, and so on, and also an opportunity for the medical marijuana or medical cannabis as well to be made available. And the goal was the government was hoping that with recreational cannabis available and medical cannabis also available, that this would squeeze the gray or black market a bit while providing verified products to those who were going to consume them. Now, the number of legal cannabis stores has increased from 2018 to 2020. And at 2018, it was about 182 stores, and it's gone up eightfold to about 1,445 in the year 2020. This growth was slowed down by the pandemic, and it's expected that the numbers may continue to rise even further. In Canada, the cannabis legislation does vary with each province. So some provinces have different restrictions to others, but the general picture is that cannabis is available for recreational use from the age of 18 or to 21. So in Alberta, it's from the age of 18, while in Quebec, it's 21. People are allowed to have up to 30 grams of cannabis on their person. And depending on the province, you can grow up to 4 plants within your household. I'll be giving some supporting slides from Canadian Cannabis Survey, the 2020 survey. And this found that on average, those who did grow plants at home had 3 plants in their household. Now, this is interesting because within the household also are young people. So a number of people would have early engagements with the cannabis plant, recognize it, and young children may, depending on where it's grown in the household, be quite early in their exposure and familiarity with the plant itself. With legislation, there's also been a shift. So cannabis can be ordered online, and in the province of Ontario, you can actually order your cannabis online. So delivery can be either in store or delivered, bought online and delivered. So there's been a shift from the industry supply, or what was then loosely described as the weed man, to actually other mechanisms. And at the moment, there are the sort of parallel markets. In Canada, cannabis is generally socially acceptable. If we look at the very bottom rows, that's tobacco, while the very top is alcohol, and in between. So the gist of this particular slide is if you were to smoke a cigarette, it'll be frowned upon, while smoking cannabis is way more acceptable, and edibles, vaping, e-cigarettes as well. So cannabis in Canada is way more socially acceptable than smoking tobacco. When we look at perception of risk, whether it's moderate to great risk, this also shifts depending on what the product is. So the perception of risk for alcohol is quite high. The perception of risk from tobacco on the right column is really high. It's about 95%, where people actually think, tobacco can cause you harm. But edible cannabis, smoking cannabis, much less. And if we look at the green columns, amongst those who've used cannabis in the past 12 months, their perception of risk is much lower for cannabis products than it is than general population. Now, in legalizing cannabis in Canada, information was also really key, and about 77% felt they had access to trustworthy information. 38% felt they had seen the warnings on the packages, and amongst those who used cannabis, about 68% felt they had seen the warnings. And I'll show you some examples of what they look like. There's a lower risk cannabis use guidelines, and this was not as well known by many people as could be, and that leaves work to be done. About nearly 60% felt warnings had improved their knowledge of harms related to cannabis. And this is really important because with cannabis consumption are issues to do with also awareness. And kudos to Johnny's ambassadors and the great work being done to raise awareness so people can make informed decisions regarding their cannabis use. Knowledge or beliefs regarding cannabis-associated harms. And it's quite interesting here because for those who use cannabis and those who don't use, and overall, there's a general acceptance that teenagers are at a greater risk of harm from the use of cannabis than adults. However, amongst those who use on a daily basis, the association with the risk of harms from mental health was actually lower, and they felt from the surveys that it didn't cause as much harm to mental health. With regards to smoking as a process, on the whole, this was very close. So the key points from this slide is that those who smoke cannabis or consume cannabis daily did not perceive it to have much mental health risk. This is an example of what packaging looks like in Canada. So the red with the THC is a symbol that's universal on all licensed products in Canada. Then there's the yellow warning box, which has the warning worded with the specific message, no gloss advertising, and then details of how much THC or CBD is in the product. So this is sort of standard presentation for products available, and I'll illustrate this much closer. Now, when cannabis was legalized initially, that was 2018 into 19, there were some warning labels, and these were quite specific and relevant to mental health. So one of them was the regular use of cannabis can increase the risk of psychosis and schizophrenia, with reference to higher content, increasing the risk of these mental illnesses. There was other reference about early use, regular use, adolescence, and the risk of harms with some ratios. Now, this has been withdrawn and is no longer being used. And with a review of the labeling, the labels I'm going to show next have been the new ones. It's noteworthy and debatable that the warnings regarding psychosis and schizophrenia have been withdrawn. So the current labels are that smoke from cannabis is harmful, and that makes sense. Smoking in any form can cause harm to the lungs. Warning not to drive or operate heavy machinery or equipment after using cannabis. Do not use if pregnant or breastfeeding. A warning that can take up to 4 hours to feel the full effects from ingesting, whether eating or drinking cannabis, and warning regarding the lasting effects. I must add that when cannabis was made available for recreational use in 2018, it was for mainly smoked products, and it wasn't until 2019, a whole year afterwards, that edible products were made legal. And this was to allow for a better cannabis etiquette and better understanding, as the effects can be quite different. In mental health space, the message is frequent and prolonged use of cannabis containing THC can contribute to mental health problems over time. And the smaller message there, or in smaller print, is daily or nearly daily use increases the risk of dependence and may bring on or worsen disorders related to anxiety and depression. It's noted here that psychosis was left out, and some parties have expressed quite strong concern that it's maybe minimizing the message. Another message is adolescents and young adults are at a greater risk of harms from cannabis, and that daily or nearly daily use can harm brain development and function. The higher the THC content of product, the more likely you are to experience adverse effects and greater levels of impairment, including anxiety, memory, and concentration. I'll be elaborating on some of these with some illustrations soon. So in Canada, there's a preference for higher THC. For recreational products, people like their THC to be higher. And about a third of those purchasing would like or purchase actually high THC products. Now, these percentages are quite different to some other parts of the world. So sometimes in the UK, products like skunk may be referred to as having THC of 10 to 15%. In Canada, that would not be in the highest spectrum of what's available for smoked products, where there are mid to higher 20s and additional products such as shatter. So there's a preference for higher THC products for recreational use. Now, some people use cannabis products for medical purposes. However, the bulk of them do not have medical documentation to support this. In Canada, cannabis is not prescribed. A person may obtain a medical approval, so it's a sort of permission to obtain cannabis products, but it's not a prescription. So cannabis is not prescribed for medical use. And highlighting here, nearly 3/4 do not have a medical document to support this. So people use it for medical purposes, which can range from trying to improve their sleep, anxiety, pain, and so on. However, do not have supporting medical documentation for this. Now, this slide looks at daily cannabis use by age and sex in the past 12 months. And what you may observe from the age 16 to 19 on the left is initially the rates here with daily consumption in the Canadian Cannabis Survey were higher for the females and gradually reduced over time. So from 23% at 16 to 19, then 20 to 24, it dropped and continued dropping. While for males, it started at around 20% and progressively increased. So 20 to 26 to 30% by 25 and above. So there are actually quite significant differences in the way cannabis is used between males and females. My apologies that this comes across rather binary, but there are differences in use across the spectrum. The frequency of cannabis use per day in the past 30 days. Some people consume a lot, several times a day. And at the very bottom here, you've got 16% using cannabis 5 times or more daily, and others 4 times, and so on. So there are a proportion of people who are using cannabis every day in large quantities. Likewise, this slide looks at the number of hours people are stoned or high in the past 30 days. And that's roughly 52% being stoned or high 4 hours or more daily. That's a lot to reflect on. 52% of those who use daily are stoned or high for 4 hours or more daily. So think of that in the context of education or the workplace or day-to-day life. This is quite significant. Perceived benefits from cannabis in the past 12 months. Now, about 46% of people responding to the Canadian Cannabis Survey felt it had benefits on their mental health. And that was actually the highest group, well, some for quality of life. But if so many people feel cannabis does improve their mental health, then we really need to understand much, much better what it is they're seeking to achieve and what benefits they hope to derive from it. Some people use to improve or perceive the benefits on their work and education life, social life, relationships, but that's a huge number. 46% perceived benefits for their mental health. And when asked the question regarding harm or no effect or harm, again, a high number, 47%, felt it did not cause them harm regarding their mental health. Now, this is important because if we think of the core message of Johnny's ambassadors and for those who work in this space or parents, people who may have used cannabis themselves or those in education or people who may interact, there's robust evidence that cannabis, particularly higher THC content, may have impact on mental health in specific individuals or certain situations, and certainly not something for us to ignore. So while some people actually recognize they have difficulties, only 2% had received professional help. And this is actually a call to all of us. Do we have the right sort of resources in place and facilities for those who may use cannabis and seek help? So far, it looks like the answer is no, a lot more to be done. So only 2% of those who had been concerned about their problematic cannabis use received professional help. Now, the next slides will be focusing on how difficult it is to pin down cannabis as one entity. And I would suggest that actually it's difficult to say cannabis and generalize. There's no single cannabis. So the term cannabis is like saying dog. What breed are we talking about? Are we talking about a Chihuahua, a Great Dane, a German Shepherd, a Husky? They're all quite different. Or cannabis is like saying car. Are we talking about a truck, a little mini, and so on? So there are different types of cannabis with different characteristics. And this is all the more why cannabis literacy is just so important. The next few slides will be showing some cannabis products available. Now, none of these are licensed for the Canadian market. They are available in North America, but it also shows how attractive this can be if we're thinking of young people. Apple drinks that are infiltrated or infused with cannabis, and one of them actually being 10 times the one in the middle, having 10 times more THC than the one on the right. The very swish looking bottles with cannabis products, the pre-rolled joints in the tins. So this can look rather attractive, and none of these products will be licensed for Canadian consumption because they're a bit too attractive and would not be in keeping with Canadian policy. So again, these are other ones. And why I show these is sometimes we think, oh, cannabis is all the smoke and the smell, but there are other cannabis products that can be quite attractive. I guess there's at least one of you that's a chocolate lover thinking, I could fancy that. And that's one of the challenges, because with 180 milligrams of THC, these are quite strong products, and they've got different ratios here. So cannabis it's not all about the smoke, and stating the obvious, and many of you know as well. Here are some products from Canada, and these are geared more towards the medical market, but you can see how they look like different types of sweets. I won't name products, but what they look like, or the gels and spansules. So cannabis isn't all about smoke, and this is all why it's very important we have an understanding of the broader range of what's available. Top left is a mint. We've got chocolates and infusible teas and so on. So it's very possible to be under the influence of cannabis and do not smoke. And that's why even when we ask questions about cannabis consumption, it's never enough to ask, do you smoke cannabis? Because a person could consume without smoking. These are sprays as well that can give different doses with their use. So once again, these are by other routes. There's smoked that goes to the lungs, there's oral ingestion, and they have different ways of working and different speed of effect. These are probably the more familiar ones to many people. The flowery tops of the female plant, emphasis. The buds are the flowery tops of the female plant. And again, these vary. This material that looks like honeycombs is what's known as shatter. And I would say shatter by name, shatter by nature. Shatter can have up to 90% THC or more in it. And this because it's been very carefully produced through solvents to really concentrate cannabis. And with Johnny's ambassadors, when you see words like dab in, shatter is often dabbed and consumed that way. It's extremely high potency. And shatter can be consumed with a potency of several joints. This is a rig and some of the paraphernalia that may be used to consume shatter. And it's quite important that as parents or other people who may not be very familiar, that you begin to familiarize yourself with what paraphernalia look like. These are other devices, electronic and vaping devices that heat the cannabis product or the oil for inhalation. And this is one of the reasons why we should also be alert in understanding cannabis consumption in younger people. Well, older people could like these too, but these look rather comical and fun, but these are bongs. These look like bottles, but again, if you look more closely, they've been adapted, and they're bongs as well, where cannabis is put in the bowl and smoked. And further examples of some bongs. This presentation would not be complete without making reference to spice or K2, and there are many other names used. Synthetic cannabis. Now, synthetic cannabis is not actually cannabis. It's not from a plant material. It's made in the laboratory and sprayed onto or infused onto plant material or consumed in some other ways with a view to achieving a similar effect. Now, because it's synthetic, when people do urine drug testing, it doesn't show up like THC and the rest, like other things that are picked up in routine urine drug testing. But apart from that, spice K2 synthetic cannabis can also have very, very dangerous and potentially lethal effects on individuals. It doesn't show up with testing, routine testing. The effects can be enduring and last so much longer. So while the plant material gets metabolized and broken down, with some of these synthetic products, the effect is that through the first round of metabolism, it's still very potent. The second round and sometimes the third round. So imagine if you had great-grandpa, grandpa, pa, and son all having equal strength. And this is one of the areas or aspects of synthetic cannabinoids, or cannabis, sorry, not a cannabinoid, that makes it quite dangerous. In the UK, in some parts, it used to be called legal highs and was treated rather trivially. However, it can be extremely dangerous, and it's important we're aware of it. So methods of consumption. My earlier slides suggested that smoking is becoming less attractive in Canada. And one of the implications of that is people are cutting down on smoking, but there's an increasing preference for edible cannabis. Cookies, gummy bears, people have started baking their own confectionery. Vaping and vaporizing has started reducing. And with the consumption of edibles comes a risk of its own, because when we smoke cannabis, the effects can so it goes through the lungs, into the bloodstream, to the brain, and within 10 minutes, the person's aware of some form of sensation. While with edibles, it could take up to half an hour or 2 hours for that sort of effect to kick in. Now, if a person has an expectation of an effect, and it hasn't happened within the half hour or 2 hours, it's all too tempting to consume more and more and more, and then gets quite seriously intoxicated. So edible cannabis consumption really needs experience and familiarization with. Edible cannabis is behind a number of intoxication and incidents with children who've taken cookies to school or shared and become very ill in the emergency department. So that's certainly an area we need to build up a lot more literacy about. Linking to edibles, a number of people have told me they've consumed edibles and gone to bed feeling okay and waking up stoned because the blood levels have just peaked up then. So moving on to cannabis use in Canadian youth, pre and post legalization. This is a really interesting paper that was published just a few weeks ago, looking at the trends in youth cannabis use across the legalization. And a summary point from the paper is the recreational cannabis legalization has not been followed by the slowing or reversing of concerning trends in youth cannabis use. So we haven't actually stopped the trend yet or slowed it down, and it's very early with data. This was from some parts of the country, but there's not been a massive change nationally. There have been observations of regional differences though. I like this slide because it tells its own story. And this is another take on higher education and high school, pardon the puns. The blue line is 2017 and the orange 2019. So roughly about 1% or 1.5% of grade 7s reported cannabis use. And the higher the grade in school, the greater percentage of cannabis use. And it's interesting that in 2017, from grade 7 to grade 12, there was a 22-fold increase in cannabis use reported by youth. From age 12 to 17, 22-fold in 2017. In 2019, that curve has gone up even higher, and there's a 31-fold from grade 7 to grade 12. So what's the right age to start getting interventions in? When should we start having these dialogues about cannabis? Because there's something going on in critical educational years with young people with developing brains that needs to be done, dialogues to be had. What else do we know? We know that the blue line, there's a 2.4-fold increase in self-reported elevation of stress, just feeling more and more stress. So the year on year in school increase, and also increase about nearly 2%, twofold of young people feeling they're experiencing serious psychological distress. So in critical years, between the age of 12 to 17 in high school, there's a worsening of mental wellness, an increase in cannabis use. And if we layer them, we've got 31-fold increase in cannabis use, grade 7 to 12, and a 2.4-fold increase in stress levels. And that's sort of generating the perfect storm, because a lot of young people tell us they use cannabis to try and relax, to chill out, to reduce their anxiety, to sleep better. And as stress is going up and cannabis consumption is going up, we've got a perfect storm evolving as they tip towards 18, 19 as well. This slide I won't spend much time on, and you can look at it in your handouts, but what it does do is summarize a whole range of variables over the last 20 years, showing that there are some aspects of youth and student mental health that have been worsening over time. Anxiety, self-rated mental health, stress, psychological distress, suicidal ideation. So this is really important to reflect on, because these are critical years of young people and their development. In the Ontario Student Drug Survey, about 2% of students said they use cannabis every day. And since legalization, about 14% said their use had increased. 14%. So we've got a situation here where there's worsening of school attendance with frequent heavy cannabis use, impaired attention, less concentration, less memory. And quite often, if we have poor attention and poor concentration, memory will be poor. In some situations, we have worsening or increased behavioral disturbance and exclusion from school. So cannabis does have quite a heavy impact, frequent heavy or problematic use on educational achievements of young people who need some form of education. Not everyone is scholarly, but it's a good platform for life. Some of you may like Charlie Brown, and pretty much the gist of this cartoon is Charlie Brown was looking rather absent in class while getting some advice, quite stoned. Now, some information from the Canadian Institute for Health Information, and key points are that 1 in 20 hospital stays among youth in Canada were related to harmful substance use. 7 in 10 of hospital stays were for harm caused by substance use among the youth. And of the substances, 40% in the year measured was from cannabis and 26% from alcohol. So cannabis was considerably more problematic in hospital admissions and crises in youth than alcohol. If we look at the different ages, 15 to 17 in the middle, the green column is cannabis. and how prevalent it is in each. So it is actually the most prevalent substance associated with harm and hospitalization in youth. A range of different disorders. And while our folks in red here on psychosis, there are different disorders. For instance, mood disorders, anxiety worsening, and others. But on the whole, mental health disorders suffering from the effects. Now, if this continued to when people are much older, the red row would actually begin to increase as psychosis emerges more from early 20s onwards. I'm going to feature now the role of cannabis in the early psychosis intervention program. And this was a program and a study we carried out in our program here in Kingston, Ontario. Heads Up is the early psychosis program, and people attending are between the age of 14 to 35. This is a program geared at helping people quite early to deal with emerging symptoms of psychosis. And nearly 83% of them, attendees, reported cannabis use. 83%, with nearly 70% with positive urine toxicology. So they weren't just reporting it, it was objectively verified. 13.5% failed to complete their higher education. And it's not really funny when a magazine starts ranking Canadian universities based on the cannabis use, a league table of cannabis use in universities for youth. 68% were below the age of 25. And why does 25 matter? Because the brain continues to develop till around the age of 25, and I'll elaborate on that. But if so many were young people with developing brains, what's the concern? Well, we know the cannabis effect is dose dependent, and the more cannabis, the higher the THC content, the greater the harm. So much lower doses, it's a different effect. And as the potency increases, the risk of harm goes up. And if we think of it on the right there, that's where the harm is greater. So the dial continues moving, and the higher the potency, the greater the risk of harms, particularly in youth and young people developing brains. And here's just a schema. So very low potency, some people find it relaxes them and reduces anxiety. You increase that a bit, and people start feeling more anxious, anxiogenic effect, and then increase further, emergent psychosis, feeling uncomfortable, and increase even further still in very high doses with frequent use, psychosis may emerge. We also hear things about ratios, and what I want to do is a really quick exercise where the amount of THC could be constant, but the CBD does matter. In a very simplistic way, and I'm oversimplifying, if we think of THC like the accelerator of the car and CBD like the brakes of the car, this can be very different. So we've got 30% THC, 10% CBD, that's a ratio of 3 to 1. 30 and 1%, that's a ratio of 30 to 1. 30 and 0.1%, 300 to 1. And 0.01, 3,000 to 1. So pretty much what we have here is like a car, like a Ferrari with standard brakes, a Ferrari with motorbike brakes, a Ferrari with bicycle brakes, and then Flintstones sticking out your foot and trying to stop. So the ratios do matter. And different literature have different opinions, but it's been suggested that about 3 times as much CBD as THC would have a sort of balancing effect. So what we know about psychosis risk is frequent, heavy use of high-potency THC increases the risk of a severe mental illness, particularly if it starts at an early age. And don't forget the graph that showed the increase in use in students. The developing brain below the age of 25, particularly also in those who've had a history of mental illness or a family history of mental illness. And this is what legalization means. In Quebec, the legal age for use is 21 years, but the brain's still developing. So it's about 84% developed. while in some provinces, or Alberta, for instance, from the age of 18, which is about 72% developed. Now that's the adolescent brain. You know, do I want to grow my hair long? Do I like music? I don't like music. Yeah, let's do it, and so on. And adolescence can be a really tricky time for many of us. And part of it's because the brain begins to generate more neurons. So if you think of the brain like a building site, you've just got wires everywhere, fuses are blowing, synapses are rewiring, and this is what's going on in our brains in adolescence, way more than we need. And then as the brain continues to develop further, around the age of 25, pruning begins, and the nerves in the brain and nerve cells begin to adjust towards the final journey. So think of it like a building site, wires everywhere, fuses blowing, all getting rather murky, tripping up. You know, yeah, let's go to Chicago. Yeah, let's go tonight. And then someone says, but how do we get to Chicago? I don't know. And do we have money? I don't know. And so on. And as the brain begins to mature further, it starts pruning and tidying up. And around the age of 25, when it's tidying up and the fuses and wires have been tidied up, the electricians and builders say, okay, chaps, your brain's mature now, we're off. So if you're doing a lot of damage to your brain while it's developing, you may have an incomplete construction site at the time you're starting your journey in early adulthood. I've sort of simplified it, but that's the general gist. Why does this matter? Well, about 3/4 of mental disorders have their genesis before the age of 24. So if 3/4 of mental disorders start around then it's a really critical time for us to be cautious. So why do we need to innovate cannabis literacy? Well, for a number of reasons. When Health Canada was legalizing, they had innovation messaging programs through radio, social media, public display, and so on. We've got magazines there, and the information out there is so much. So how do we actually get reliable information on cannabis to make our judgments? Well, sometimes we can debate these things, and I implore you, those who are campaigning for increased cannabis literacy, we can all play a role in this. There are colleges now offering higher education and cannabis courses. And covering the concepts briefly as I come close to the end of knowledge push and knowledge pull. Knowledge push is the information we try to get out for people to know that we think they need to know, and knowledge pull is what people seek out. And they may not be the same thing. So knowledge push will be the low risk cannabis use guidelines, encouraging abstinence, not to use at a young age. If you use low THC, avoid synthetic, avoid smoking, careful with inhalation, don't use in pregnancy, don't use with driving. So that's knowledge push. But there's a lot of other space going on. And these are just quick examples, but close to 2/3 of a billion views on YouTube of Snoop Dogg's song, Smoke Weed Every Day, or Afro Man. And these are big influencers with multiple million views on YouTube. So we health professionals and others are not the only people in cannabis influencing space. I like this musician because of his messaging, and Logic's a young man who sings about mental health, about suicide and risk of harm and mental health issues. And what it shows here also is with the 1-800 song, you can get nearly 500 million views on YouTube from positive mental health messaging. So this is actually a call out to us. What do people search for? In the US, the term weed attracts more than marijuana and cannabis, and people aren't really searching for the term cannabis. While in Canada, the word cannabis is used way more than marijuana, and the peak there you see in the middle was when cannabis was legalized. There are websites and apps that provide all sorts of information and reviews. Now, whether these are accurate or not is really important. We know that our young people access them. Again, and by no means am I endorsing any of this, but this is the sort of information out there. We're messaging going out through apps and websites about what combinations of THC and CBD can work for insomnia, anxiety, depression, nausea. So we need to be in this space with evidence-based messaging as well. This I'll make available for anyone interested through Laura and Johnny's ambassadors. It's the Cannabis Contemplation Circle that I designed, and it's a way of measuring the willingness stages and willingness to change from cannabis use or harmful cannabis use in those who may be doing motivational work. This is another example of very skillful knowledge push. It's a website called drugcocktails.ca, and behind the knowledge here we have provincial pharmacists, addiction specialists, and so on. And it's a resource available to young people where they can sort of discreetly check for information about drugs and drug combinations and so on. And in the top right corner, that's one of my favorite features. If mum and dad walk into a room, you can click the hide this site and something else will just come up like a search bar. So it's quite discreet. What has COVID done? COVID has not been cannabis neutral. About 40 to 52% of those who use cannabis report having increased their use in the last year and a half. So what are we going to come out with in the next few months or years? Greater rates of cannabis dependence possibly, and harmful use. So wrapping up, cannabis is available in Canada legally within particular age limits. I've covered the risk of harms and the challenges with younger people and their heavy consumption. I've given a bit of a profile from an early psychosis program and the challenges, particularly in the developing brain, of high potency cannabis, THC use with cannabis. And the question then is, as people roll the joints, are they also rolling the dice with their mental health? Let's be informed and support people so they can roll lucky. These are my contact details, email above, and Twitter handle. Thank you very much.
This is so fascinating and actually scary. We have a lot of people who are asking some questions. I'm going to take the slides down here so I can talk with you. You know, it's so fascinating, the differences and similarities in Canada. The very first question someone asked was one that I had myself. It's clear from the research you just showed that it causes psychosis. And why do you think those labels were changed? The question specifically was, do you think this was due to industry influence or because Health Canada did their own independent studies? Did someone actually show it did not cause psychosis, and was that why the label was removed?
I've been asked that question many times. I wish I had an answer. It troubles me. It troubles me a lot because any practitioner working in the front line, any parent who has a child who's been using heavily, anyone who's been using heavily in their own personal space, they do know that cannabis high potency can make them paranoid.
Yes.
We know it can bring forward psychosis, the number of years. So if I was at risk of a psychotic illness, it can bring it forward 3 to 6 years. It can totally worsen the trajectory of a psychotic illness. So I'm baffled, very baffled. There are hypotheses, but I'll keep to objective to what I know. I'm baffled, totally perplexed.
Okay, so there was not a study, to be clear, that showed it did not increase psychosis, because all the research we have here in the US, the peer-reviewed journals, show that it does. So it must just be part of Canada's purpose in legalizing, I suppose, to make it appear safer, that they're doing a service for the public.
Well, it's a big concern, and I'll make something available through your site. I mean, I did a study looking at what was referred to then, and I used the language of the time in the 1800s, looking at Indian hemp as it was referred to then, and insanity.
Ah.
graphs were exactly the same age then. And this is a time when the THC content was much less.
Right.
The ones in 1800s that were documented in the British Empire then were identical. Avoid giving to children. The high potency material, ganja and so on, cause greater risk of then, the language used then, insanity.
Wow.
Dispensaries should avoid selling to young people or people who were ill. So we've known this for over 1.5 centuries.
Yeah, this is not new news.
Totally perplexed.
Okay. So in your charts, we see that rates have not decreased in youth. Wasn't that one of the stated purposes for Canada legalizing?
Yes, if we broaden the whole range of meaning of harms, so harms may be, for instance, also using substances that haven't been tested, but the rates of cannabis use certainly have not come down. In some jurisdictions, it's gone up. In some jurisdictions, it's a flat line, but it hasn't come down. Now, you can argue, okay, it's early days, but a way of looking at it is cannabis is so ubiquitous here that it's not seen as a big deal.
Wow.
It just,
Yeah.
and the
Same here. The
comparison is
perceptions
striking.
of harm continue to go down in the US as well.
Yeah, and that means we've got availability, we've got an ease of access, we have attitudes that are favorable in some situations, we've got increasing numbers in younger people. So I think the timeline is still to be extended, but without a shadow of doubt, any parent, anyone who's spent time with someone suffering the ill healths of cannabis knows this is serious business.
Absolutely. Let's see. Will you please discuss the effect of the synthetic cannabis versus the plant cannabis derived? Is that I understand the spice is manufactured to perfectly fit into the receptor in the brain versus a similar fit for anandamide and THC. Is there a much greater, is that why there's a greater difference in harm of the effect and the safety on the synthetics?
Yes, synthetics are a huge problem. And I'll give examples. Synthetics can be sprayed onto substances. In the UK, they've caused a lot of problem in corrections. So I could spray synthetics, and I'm not teaching anyone bad tricks. The dogs don't, sniffer dogs don't pick them up. I can spray it on, into Bible and say, Deji, make sure you read Psalm 23. And I know exactly what page has been sprayed on. Now, what they do is they really lock onto the receptors, but they lock on so hard without any CBD or any of the other cannabinoids to modulate. And with each cycle, they're still there. They just don't shift. And my concern is as we begin to test and with legalization and so on, there are people who will be using synthetics to try and go under the radar. And so they worry me. They can cause all sorts of fatality. A person can use synthetics and turn up in the emergency department and no one would know what to look for. And
Wow.
they're in little packages like condom packs and so on. Very easy to carry around. They've got names like Black Mamba and so on. And clinically, I've found them one of my most difficult situations because the clear out period, a person smokes a joint or uses an edible, you can pretty much predict the timeline which will wash out. With these, they just stick. And that's why I meant that grandpa, the son, it just metabolize, it just sticks there and it takes a lot of time to shift. So they worry me a lot. And there are deaths that happen with synthetics. They're reported randomly here and there, but the numbers are beginning to stack up. A big concern.
Okay. How long does it take when a youth is in psychosis for them to get out of that and be normal again?
Each of us is different. And the thing with psychosis, so being out of touch with reality, there's being stoned or intoxicated. If I use the example of alcohol, so the person's used cannabis, they may be paranoid or giggly or confused, and that could be an intoxicant effect, which could sort of wear off. Well, if I had an underlying risk of schizophrenia and I didn't know, and I kept using high potency cannabis, it may just wake it up. So it's like kicking a sleeping dog. Well, don't kick any dog, but waking it up, and you can't guarantee whether it'll go to sleep. Very sadly, in my clinical practice, there have been situations where beautiful, promising young people have gone into psychosis, and initially everyone thought, oh, it's drug-induced psychosis, but the symptoms just didn't go. And it's continued through to schizophrenia until we have very good genetic tests. They'll probably come up in the future where you can test. I mean, in the future, probably you can just test and say, okay, Lisa, you metabolize differently, your receptor profile is different, so you can't take much. Don't be like a brother Matthew and so on. But we don't know yet.
That would be very helpful for further education if they would actually use it and heed the advice. I think so many kids, as you mentioned, in adolescence are such risk takers that they, it's never going to happen to them. So that would be fantastic to actually have an objective test to add to our arsenal when educating our youth.
Yes.
You'll have to get on that, Deji.
There are people on this, I can tell you.
From my friend in Canada, Doug, what is the best way, do you think, to educate the Canadian public on this very complicated subject so they can better understand that today's marijuana can be harmful for teens and young adults? The perception here is, what's the big deal? It's just weed. How are you going to go about combating this perception you explained to us up there?
Yeah, well, we need to get into that space, and some of that space is being innovative in the way we do our messaging. So, for instance, there's a game, a family game I do called the weed balls, and what we do is you pass a ball around, and then at a moment when the person's under harmful use of cannabis, rather than catch one ball, I'm chucking about 30 balls at them. Now, trying to catch 30 balls at the same time, I then use to illustrate what happens with receptors when they're just so loaded. And in that moment, when you're trying to catch 30 balls at the same time, that's what psychosis.
That's a great illustration.
It's really interesting because when you then tell the young people, dopamine or antipsychotic medications try to reduce the number of balls. So you can actually be an active participant in that way in doing that. So they're innovative things. I have a rather cute hockey game called Pot Puck, and we incorporate it. So it really is us, and better still, co-development with young people. They're really good at getting the message in. If they understand and believe or have a good understanding, they can develop messaging in a way Flintstonian parents can't.
That's a great point. And peers are so critical in being able to convince other peers, hey, this messed me up, don't use it.
Exactly.
Being able to get that message out, I think, through the youth rather than us old people admonishing them not to use would be a really powerful strategy. We continue to look at that ourselves at Johnny's Ambassadors. Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. I went to a breakout session in Canada that said that Canada is the first country conquered by cannabis. And the attitude of the presenter is that Canadians are naive and easy to manipulate about pot. Do you have an opinion about that?
As you can guess, I don't have a Canadian accent. I live here with very warm, welcoming people. And so I don't have an opinion on that. It's
that's fair.
Let's go a bit. But what I will say is there's a heck of a lot the world can learn from Canada. There are lessons learned. And I think if I was to legislate in another country, ensure that a lot of health professionals, parents, teachers, all those involved have much higher cannabis literacy to be able to support young people in their time of need.
And that is a great way to close us out with that final comment. And the rest of the comments are all truth. Thank you. Great presentations. One of the best. Appreciate your time. So I will just echo our audience here. And thank you so much, Deji, for your gift of your time, your talent, and especially for honoring Johnny in this way and being one of his ambassadors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. Sorry, I'm just a voice. I'm not AI.
Wow. This was incredible information, and we sure appreciate you sharing all of this gift of knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, everyone, take care. See you next time.